If I could just have your attention, I want to welcome our new attendees. We have some folks who are new to day 2, so welcome to Vassar. And I want you all to think just a tiny bit about how much fun it is to be back at school. I say that because the Olmsteds, as you have heard, were very active in campus design, hundreds and hundreds of campuses around the country. The Olmsted Network was very lucky to work with a number of campuses very closely during the bicentennial, including Vassar, Stanford, Trinity, Lawrenceville, University of Chicago, and Washington University of St. Louis. And we are very proud of a university toolkit, which you can find on the olmsted.org website. I urge you to visit it. It includes papers and thesis topics. We are particularly desirous of encouraging scholarship about the Olmsted firm. Percival Gallagher, you heard a little bit about today, Edward Whiting, Emmanuel Mish. There is so much to be done, and we hope that we will be able to encourage that amongst college campuses. And we are hoping that we can encourage exhibits as Vassar undertook, landscape history tours, and Nature RX. You heard about that. This is a campus initiative across the country. We'll take a little credit for introducing Vassar to the idea because we had a special webinar on universities and student well-being. And so we are encouraging that as well, and it is one of many recommendations at the University Toolkit. Last but not least, for our planning at the Olmsted Network, we are working on a college campus project. We know that college campuses provide a very formative experience for students, and so we are hoping to identify Olmsted campuses across the country so that students, even if they're not interested in landscape architecture, will learn a bit more about being on an Olmsted campus. Well, this way, we can identify these campuses and tie them back to the Olmsted Network. We're looking for funding for this project, so you feel free to talk to me after this panel discussion. But with that, let me call up Steve Livengood, who will introduce this, and our other panelists who will take a seat. Thank you.
Good morning. I am Steve Livengood, a member of the Olmsted Network Board of Directors and public historian for the United States Capitol Historical Society, where I conduct tours and train volunteer guides for another Olmsted landscape, the U.S. Capitol grounds. It's a real pleasure to be here in Poughkeepsie and Newburgh and to see more of the vast physical legacy of Frederick Law Olmsted and the Olmsted firm, which numbers over 5,000 sites over the country. The Olmsted Network champions Olmsted's parks and landscapes around the country, and you can learn more about us at www.olmsted.org. But we don't just stop with the landscapes themselves. What we also seek to do, and what we will do in the next 2 panels, is to zero in on the enduring principles of Olmsted design, community, democratic spaces, and public health. We believe that applying and expanding these Olmstedian principles can help cities be safer, more livable, and more equitable. I invite you to look at the conference program, which gives you the detailed biographies so we can jump right into the matters before us. And let me introduce Paris Roselli, the moderator, and his fellow panelists to begin. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Well, good morning. As said, my name is Paris Roselli. I am president of the not-for-profit that manages the Richardson Olmsted Campus in Buffalo, New York. We also have, of course, a wonderful OlmstedVaux Parkway system. Not loud enough, huh? All right, that's unusual. Thank you. So what I want to do quickly is just introduce our panelists. Again, the summary is in your book, so take a look. We have, well, to my left here, Jennifer Thomas, Assistant Professor of Landscape Architecture at Virginia Tech. We have next to her Robert Kirkbride, Professor of Architecture and Product Design at the Parsons School of Design. And then we have Yvonne Lowy. She's a Poughkeepsie Historic Preservation Commission and is very involved. And what you'll see back here are a series of slides that were meant to provide some context for what we'll be talking about. We may reference some later, but they should help illuminate the discussion. So with that, our focus today, of course, is on preservation and mental health and ultimately adapting these Olmsted designs to modern needs. So we're going to look a little bit back at how we got here and then talk a little bit about where we might be able to go. So with that in mind, I'm going to start off with Jennifer and really ask, given your work and your studies, if you could perhaps set the stage for everyone here when it comes to the 19th century insane asylum landscapes.
Thank you. I have written quite a bit and researched the evolution of the New York State system in the 19th century. And I want to start out by saying, first and foremost, that this idea of therapeutic landscapes and their attachment to places of mental health did not originate with Olmsted, nor did it originate with Downing. It goes back a little bit further. So for the purposes, especially for, I would say, the American version of asylums, we trace it back to specific English traditions, including William Tuke, who in the late 18th century founded the Retreat at York, and that was a place, he was a Quaker, and it was a place in which they wanted to treat people with mental health issues in a different way, in a non-punitive way. And so it was a small place, and there is a slide somewhere in the show here that shows that. And it was a small place, but it was one in which the landscape played a critical role, not only in supporting the institution, but in providing some therapeutic means to the patients therein. And his great-great-grandson subsequently took over the property and wrote a treatise about this particular institution. And so in New York, back in the 18 teens, the legislature and some philanthropists, some politicians, et cetera, wanted to start to treat people in the US, which started in New York City. I won't go into great detail, but Thomas Eddy, who was also a Quaker and a merchant banker, philanthropist, he was connected with New York Hospital a bit, and he wrote a treatise about the treatment of patients as well, like the kind treatment of patients. And so he was involved not only with that, but with the construction of the Erie Canal. And so if you look at kind of the development of asylums in New York State, you actually see how they kind of follow the canal, right? Because the canal was critical for places like Utica. And so Utica was the first state hospital that was open. We had two earlier ones. There was the Bloomingdale Asylum, which was attached to New York Hospital up in Upper New York. That's now where Columbia University is. So that was first opened in 1821. Then we had the one in the 1830s on Blackwell's Island. But the state really wanted to have one separate that was out in the country, and so they established the one in Utica, which opened in 1843. And then as things progressed, as they always do, right, there were issues of budget constraints, overcrowding, et cetera. So there's this long kind of progression of continual, let's open up another one, fill it up, let's open up another one. I mean, that's being a little glib, but you get the point. So we had Willard that opened in 1869. That was the original location of the New York State Agricultural College, but it got shut down because of the war, and so Ezra Cornell got involved, and they actually eventually kind of moved that, and that became Cornell University. There was Binghamton, which was originally opened as an inebriate hospital, but became an asylum later on with epic controversies I won't get into. And then the one in Poughkeepsie here, the Hudson River State Hospital, opened in 1871. And that's the one that Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted had worked on. Downing had worked on the original plans for Utica, by the way. And so there were a few more, including one in Middletown, Buffalo, that most people know, and then finally one in Ogdensburg that was opened in 1890, along with one in Rochester. And so one of the key things, as all the panelists know, right, is that Thomas Story Kirkbride, who was working in Pennsylvania, also a Quaker, was hired to become the superintendent of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, which was located outside of Philadelphia. And he wrote a very influential treatise, 1854, about the construction and management of asylums. And this is where we change the shape and nature of asylum buildings from kind of a U shape to that staggered building kind of V shape. But throughout this entire time, there is really a strong connection between, I'm almost done, I promise, but there's a strong connection between the building and the landscape, not only in terms of people working on the landscape or exercising or walking around, having, there were pleasure gardens, pleasure grounds on these sites. But, where was I going with that? Kirkbride. Now I've lost my place. Sorry. But the point being that the Kirkbride treatise was incredibly influential in the U.S. And became kind of the gold standard in some ways. But that in and of itself, if you look at the Ogdensburg map or some of the later ones, that chevron gets morphed more and more and then kind of dissolves at the turn of the century, and they come up with new therapeutic ideologies. But that connection between landscape and building were crucial, because it wasn't just about being in the landscape, it was also being able to view the landscape. There's all kinds of literature related to that. And there's a strong parallel between the language that they use for asylum landscapes and large park advocacy, right? So there is a connection, there's a strong connection between the professionalization of medicine and the professionalization of landscape architecture during this time. So that's my spiel, and I'll be quiet now. Thank you.
All right, thanks for the background. And just to maybe bring it to a specific point, I look after, again, the Richardson Olmsted Campus, and we're familiar with Olmsted and Vaux and the focus of democratizing green space for communities, healthful spaces, the lungs of the community. Buffalo is a city in a park. And what's interesting is at that period of time, if you think about all of those movements, and there was quite an interesting progressive nationwide movement around treating people with mental illness humanely. So prior to some of these things that we'll talk about, there were really no solutions for people with severe mental illness. So you take this progressive movements, you take the building and the architecture, and you take the environment, which Olmsted was a big proponent, of course, and they're curative in combination. Another layer of that is, for those of you who haven't looked it up, Richardson and Olmsted were neighbors. They were good friends. Their kids played together, and they collaborated across the country on this integration of landscape and building. So I would suggest you take a look at that. But fundamentally, this healthful environment, this asylum or refuge, you use these Olmsted terms, the asylum was a refuge from the hustle and bustle of the community. If you think about cities at that period of time, you would have had coal and burning everywhere, you would have had horse manure everywhere, and you read the transcripts or the superintendent's reports, and boy, it was, all the neighbors weren't being very nice to each other, and people were focused on making money, and all the things we're familiar with were causes. So these green spaces are really medicinal in purposes. They were deployed within our campus at the Richardson to provide a curative environment, a healthful work environment. There was an active farm. So with that nexus now of the landscape and the architecture, I wanted to ask Robert, you're involved with the group called Preservation Works, and what I'd like to hear from you is a little bit about how you're advocating for the preservation and the adaptive reuse of these Kirkbride-plan hospitals, and ultimately Kirkbride's connection into Olmsted.
Thank you, Paris, and thank you, Jen, for introducing, giving some of the background, which I can go a little bit deeper in this integration of the buildings from the exteriors to the interiors and the role that they played in Kirkbride's description in his treatise. The group that I work with is Preservation Works, as Paris noted, and we formed in 2015 in the wake of the unnecessary demolition of Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital in Morris Plains, New Jersey, which was ranked among the top 5 architectural losses by the National Trust that year. And our constituency is a very non-traditional group of preservationists, urban explorers who are deeply passionate and knowledgeable about these buildings. They've explored them, they've broken into them, and also in order to preserve them now. We've taken, we work with local communities. We've worked with Paris up at Buffalo, and we're working with Yvonne here in Hudson. And our work includes the data gathering, information about the different sites, as well as also we, at Greystone, we intervened and worked with the demolition company to extract facade elements to preserve for memorials. And so we have a group working on a memorial at Greystone. I'm also part of a memorial group that Yvonne leads, that Frankowski is also sitting on as well. And our aims are oftentimes stymied a bit by local politics and mechanics that problematize the proper memorialization of those who lived, worked, and died at the sites, as well as the extraordinary historical documentary importance of the buildings themselves that have very difficult histories. And our members and network, which is a national nonprofit group that absorbed the charter from the 501c3 who is defending Greystone. So there's a legacy in the formation of our group as well. We've worked with Athens, Ohio, Traverse City, Michigan, leading tours, extended photographic tours, because many of our members, such as including Yvonne, are extraordinary artists and photographers who are interested in the material history. And so one thing that I can emphasize a little bit about Kirkbride's own view about that exterior coming to the interior, why this matters for us now, is that he focused on the orientation of the buildings, and that stagger step back was strategic. He writes an article in 1847 identifying that the saddest place is at the junction of buildings. It's the most dismal corner. So you need to set them back, and that will improve natural ventilation from prevailing breezes. It will expand the amount of sunlight, natural sunlight, as well as also provide the views that Jennifer was referring to this landscape that surrounded the building. So it was part of beauty as therapy, and the building was an armature that really supported that and complemented the landscape. If you look at the romantic, picturesque nature of many of the landscapes that were developed, and Downing designed the first landscape for Trenton that opened in 1848, and then Olmsted and Vaux did Hudson, and then Buffalo as well. Typically, these landscapes were very natural and organic in their forms, whereas the buildings were very clear in their structure. That meant that within the buildings, what Kirkbride and his colleagues believed was the building had to provide a degree of structure for the day-to-day operation, not only the performance of the building, but how it informed the daily habits of the occupants and restructured their daily lives. So the buildings, it was not so much institutional to be rigid, it was complemented with the natural surroundings. But another important point to really recognize with the exterior to interior flows of the buildings is that the materials themselves flowed from the exterior. What we now call sustainable design was what was done by pragmatic necessity at the time. Most of the materials were quarried on site, as at Hudson. The 18.5 million bricks it took to build Athens, Ohio, Athens Lunatic Asylum, were carefully, strategically excavated from the clay around the Hocking River in order to provide the lakes for the pleasure grounds. So there was an efficiency and effectiveness that combined beauty with pragmatism. And in that way, Olmsted and Kirkbride absolutely shared that degree of a very unique combination of Enlightenment science and Enlightenment spiritualism that absolutely comes from the Quaker strain. And when we consider old forest growth, old growth forests, the point that Yvonne mentioned about the American chestnut, you will find American chestnut and traces of old growth forests embedded in the roof trusses, the joists, the floors of American chestnut, maple, Michigan, northern Michigan pine. You will find them at Buffalo in the historic reports. They've done the testing. That's quantified, it's analyzed. You'll find it in Athens, you'll find it in Traverse City, Michigan, as well as other Kirkbrides. So you find the very materials that have become precious, rare, that are otherwise lost, they are preserved in these buildings. The buildings are historical documents that are precious. And it's not just releasing carbon footprint, it's wasting shared intelligence. So I think, and another small thing I'll just add, is that there was also a significant flow from the interiors of the hospitals to the exteriors. And I mean that in terms of the humans who lived there. Interestingly, Kirkbride connected all the dots of every single operation you would conceivably need in the hospitals, except one significant thing. He never mentions the word death or dying, morgue or cemetery, not once in the entire comprehensive 80-page version in 1854 or the 341-page version in 1880, not once. Of course, hopefully nobody was supposed to die at the asylums. However, the larger they became, which is one of the posters our group has produced of the increasing size over time that we'll scroll through, that the larger the buildings became, the less likely you were to return. The most extreme cases were at the outer wings. The closer you were to the administration building at the center, the more likely you were to return. And these cemeteries are themselves of unmarked graves in New York State, about 55,000 unmarked graves at psychiatric asylums. For reasons of privacy that are antiquated, we do not know many of the names and histories that have been overlooked and forgotten. And the cemeteries are an incredibly important, rich part of the landscapes and the buildings together still today.
Great, thanks for that. Building on the architecture and the landscape, just like the parks were made for, again, democratizing the space, and you have people of different classes meeting in the park system for socialization. Healthful socialization was a goal, so when you look at these buildings, the way they were designed inside and out and vice versa, the patient rooms were 9 by 11, basically. That's where you slept. And your intention was that you would be out in these things called day rooms, these massive halls, 15 feet wide, 16 feet high, that let in the sunlight and the fresh air. The intention was you socialized, you interacted with your fellow patients. And not only that, but the landscape upon which these were built. They had self-sustaining farms. They had the bucolic landscape for, again, kind of relaxation, and to make people calmer, because the intention was to get out of that agitated state. So with those examples, Yvonne, I'd like to chat with you about the Poughkeepsie State Institution and the OlmstedVaux and Withers connection and what you're hoping to achieve there.
Thank you. Our hospital here in Poughkeepsie was built, it started in 1868 and it opened in October of 1871. It was designed to accommodate 250 people total. Within 2 years, we were double that. And then, as the need arose, they built other buildings, not in the Kirkbride-plan, but more in a cottage plan around the site. And at its capacity, if anybody's been in Poughkeepsie, you've probably seen the giant building before it was demolished. The Cheney building, that was our more recent building. It also housed a nursing school. At its peak, the site took care of 5,000 patients. So it was a significant hospital, and the development of therapy and medicines, slowly made the hospitals obsolete, and the state shut the property down. So fast forward, it sat abandoned, and fast forward to 2015. There were some interests before this, but there was a number of reasons why the property never took off. A developer came in and bought the property, and I'm on the town's Historic Preservation Commission, so my interest is solely this property, and I've been working on it for 9 years now. It's a never-ending love. The property, they demolished much of the South Campus. I envision this site as 2 campuses. There's the South Campus, which was the Cheney building where the nursing school was, and then there's the North Campus where the predominant historic buildings were built, the brick buildings, the quarried stone that Robert refers to. This building is sitting in a terrible state. Much of it is on the slate to be demolished. However, I am fighting very hard to convince the developers to be more creative in their approach to these buildings and to preserve and reuse as much as they can. Right now, there's currently 6 structures on the site that will be reused. And that includes the administration building, which is the central portion of that echelon plan. There's the Avery Chapel, a little library building, an amusement hall that was a multi-purpose space they used for an indoor gym. They also had programs and dances and concerts there for the patients, and the director's residence. Then the oddball, which SHPO kind of designated that was significant, is the northernmost tower off the north wing, which is only unique in that the 3rd story or 4th story windows are arched as opposed to rounded. I'll take what I can get, so I'm not complaining. So that's where we're at right now. They've completely redeveloped the South Campus. There's ShopRite and retail, strip mall type of thing. But currently the North Campus is in limbo, and my concern is that the longer it sits, the worse it's going to get, and security, keeping the property, it's like Swiss cheese. It's impossible to keep people out of the property. There was a number of fires, devastating fires. One in 2018, the most recent one was in 2018, where the administration building, which is to be saved, caught fire, and we lost the entire roof and 4th floor, part of the 3rd floor. I championed with the town. I reminded the town council that this was a building that was in contract to be saved, and it couldn't be sitting there any longer without a roof. We all know without a roof, you don't have a building. And so they had to rebuild a roof, which was I'm proud of. Thank you. So this is an example, it'll go fast, of what the site looks like today. This is the South Campus, where all that retail stuff is. The Great Lawn, which is attributed to Olmsted and Vaux, outside of the first annual report that was issued by the hospital, there's a mention there where Olmsted and Vaux were contracted to work on the property to create an environment that was healing and something that created paths and follies and an inviting, welcoming, healing landscape. As I mentioned, there's significant amount of property, 826 acres total at the length or the peak of the property's growth, and hundreds of acres of farming. I've seen pictures, they've inventoried all their cows, so there's like 1,000 pictures of cows in their archives. Not enough pictures of buildings, in my opinion, but the odd thing, and I'm sorry if I'm rambling, the odd thing is that beyond that first annual report, I haven't been able to substantiate Vaux and Olmsted's work on the site. And I've done tons of research. The Olmsted company has a file number for the property and the project. However, the file is empty, which is so sad. But I've been digging into some of the history, and much of this history, the original artifacts and original documents are gone. They were lost. The New York State, I'm sure you guys can attest to this, did a terrible job when they packed up these hospitals. They literally left the things in the buildings and just walked away. So we're talking patient records, we're talking architectural plans. It's appalling. So much of this history is piecemeal. I'm trying to find little bits to substantiate Olmsted and Vaux's relationship to Hudson, and I found a couple of little nuggets which make me feel much more confident that they were involved. And one of the anecdotes that I'd like to refer to is I was reading a letter from Frederick Clark Withers, who Withers and Vaux designed our main building. I neglected to mention that. They designed our high Victorian Gothic building, which is the echelon plan. Withers writes Olmsted a personal letter saying, hey, can you lend me $200? The hospital is late to pay. So that's like, you got to find some comedy in all of that somehow. But so my involvement currently is to try to enlist support and raise awareness of this hospital, try to work between the town and the developer, for which sometimes I have a good relationship, sometimes I have a cold relationship with, depending on where we're at. But just trying to see reuse of the buildings. And I'm not expecting them to turn them into perfect museums of this former hospital. I want to see affordable and mixed use and mixed income housing. It has the potential for being a destination for Poughkeepsie. And I just want to see it back on the tax roll as a taxpayer, and I want to see it being used in an amenity for the town.
Great. Well, thanks for that background, and it's interesting, and basically I'll frame this question for all using a little bit of background from our own Richardson campus. We were about 200 acres, and it was designed for about 600 and some patients. I think we hit well over 3,000 at one point. And the conversations we've even had yesterday about the different parks and struggling with funding and the give and take. I mean, we have the same thing, the neglect. When you don't repair a roof on a building, especially up north, the freeze-thaw cycle just explodes the bricks and the rocks, and then you have the vandals and the rest. So when the state walked away from a number of these, it caused us some challenge to try to even the amount of money just to restore them. So on our campus, the green space was taken advantage of in 1937. There was a parking lot installed. It was a brilliant idea. So the OlmstedVaux South Lawn has this nice big parking lot. We then saw around that same time frame the top 100 or so acres were chopped off and given to Buffalo State University. And so the farm mostly went away. And ultimately, when you think about the things about the challenges, if you will, about reusing these spaces, both the landscape and the buildings, the way I liken it is that we have this building, especially along the Kirkbride-plan, with these large hallways and these tiny patient rooms, and the echelon pattern, which, by the way, at least in our case, Olmsted told Richardson, orient the building a little bit southeast to maximize the sunlight and the fresh air. So, the architect and landscape architect were very intertwined. But when you have a building that has a floor plate that's 2/3 common area and 1/3 this usable space, by the way, 3-foot thick walls in many instances, all masonry, it's hard to reuse it. And I liken it to a machine for mental health, and it's the 1870s model, and we've since moved on. So what does one do with both the grounds that haven't been kept up or have parking lots that have these buildings that are not really easy to convert into modern spaces? So As you all have been working on your projects and studying, I guess, what other challenges do you see on repurposing these spaces? And whoever wants to grab it.
I can jump in if you don't mind.
Sure.
I forgot to mention that at some point in the 30s, the state allowed the Great Lawn and much of the northwest side of the property to be developed into a golf course. So we did lose a lot of our, probably, if there were OlmstedVaux intentions and implementations, I have a feeling that those were much erased. But so one of the, in the master plan for this development, they say to restore the Great Lawn. However, because we don't have any documentation of what that originally looked like, the best I am fighting for is to getting a historic landscape architect or somebody who specializes in OlmstedVaux to try to apply principles to the Great Lawn to rehabilitate it. There are going to be some paths. We're fortunate to have the walkway over the Hudson and the rail trail. So we are connecting the rail trail to the property and then down to the river. But it is also going to be an amenity to the town. It's going to be relinquished to the town. So it is going to be something for everybody, and I'm excited about that. Yeah.
One thing I would just call out, first of all, I'd start off by saying Hudson is one of 5 national historic landmarks that are Kirkbride hospitals. So that should be mentioned, that a national historic landmark is at risk and is being underutilized with no specific plan to support it. And so therefore Lucy Lawless spoke yesterday about National Historic Registration, the significance of it, but it's also important to note that 10 of the Kirkbrides that were torn down had NHRP status. 12 of them that are still currently in operation do not have any NHRP status, precisely because the current owners don't want to be restricted by that. So there are real nuts and bolts conditions around the buildings. And so what are the problems that we face? Either the assumption that that registration is going to single-handedly protect the buildings. That's a false assumption. Mm-hmm. And there are also other mindsets that we have. These buildings are on choice pieces of ground because this was not urban planning, urban renewal planning mid-20th century where you put public housing on the cheapest, most toxic land possible. These sites are brilliant pieces of natural ventilation, natural exposure, farmlands, etc. That it was a whole total view of a self-sustaining, somewhat utopian view of how we could provide places for mental healing and how patients had agency as part of that through occupational therapy, etc. That has been greatly restricted, and patients have been transformed more into passive recipients of either pharmaceuticals or other treatments rather than places that restore and support that, be they public parks or be they places that, as Thomas Insel, former head of NIM, the National Institute of Mental Health, had said, we just need places to go. Even for 24 hours a week, a few days, we need places to support post-traumatic stress in increasingly traumatic circumstances that are not just soldiers coming back overseas. This is in our towns with shootings. These are in public schools. These are children. These are natural disaster events. We need places to go. And the hardest place, the frustration that we have is that the view of the mindset, American mindset of redevelopment, erase and replace. We have developers who want to push on stigmas and bruises in communities to erase those histories. And so therefore they don't want communities to have agency. So what Yvonne is doing, what Paris is doing to actually invite communities into using the sites, the landscapes that you're doing in Paris, is extraordinarily powerful. And there's a younger generation of passionate explorers and non-traditional preservationists who are absolutely desiring to know more about these sites and mental illness because they are experiencing it in the front lines. We still need places. They don't need to be as massive. Kirkbride was right. 200, 250 is about the maximum size that we can really treat in a given place. And a lot of more recent places are of that scale, interestingly enough.
So just in terms of, this is wobbling, kind of from a landscape historian perspective, it's interesting to look at these and think about the evolution in terms of the ways in which they were maximized, right? I mean, it's like the ideal is 250, maybe 300 patients max, but it kept increasing and they kept building, at least in New York State and certainly elsewhere. You could look at Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, you know, a lot of the kind of northeastern states were doing this. And then, you know, once the kind of Freudian model and then pharmaceuticals come along, it really shifts in the 20th century. And yet the state, New York State, was still continuing to build additional places. So if you think of, you know, anybody that might be from Long Island, you might know about Kings Park State Hospital. And that's very much a cottage plan. But that one, and it's not an Olmsted, you know, it was built in the early 20th century. But it was originally like a farm, like for people to go to and work. But at its max, it's interesting, the system itself, the max number of patients, or the height of it, was kind of mid-20th century. So if you think about it, that makes sense because it's post-war, right? And Kings Park in 1950-something, their max number of patients was 9,000 and change, right? So it was massive. And there's actually a John Huston documentary that is filmed on that site showing patients, specifically soldiers. And it's disturbing, but they're talking, you know, they're showing treatment of people and showing how they're symptomatic and whatever. But that's been converted into a state park. But it's still got the problem, right, of all these buildings, many of which that have asbestos and other kind of issues that need to be addressed. There was a state plan for demolition of that, but it cost millions of dollars even just to demolish them, to do them, you know, like you're supposed to if you have asbestos, lead, et cetera. So there's issues with finance, size. You know, the size can be a great thing or it can be a real hindrance, right? So you have to think about those things. And, you know, I'm always saddened when bad things happen to asylums. I mean, it's difficult because they are places of great sadness, right? They have difficult histories. People have very complicated associations with them, whether they were an employee, whether they were a patient. And how do you kind of honor that, right? And engage with that painful history and yet also adapt things, right? And that's, I think, sometimes a rub too, because people, I think, want to erase those bad memories, right? So that's part of that impetus of like, let's raise it, you know, because it's like, ugh, nobody wants to talk about that anymore. Well, you know, I think a lot of people do because people, you know, are always asking me about this stuff. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
That's a good tie-in to the memorialization. With in my site at Hudson, there, like you said, without patients, there was no hospital. So the patients come first in my mind. But then you can't forget the many layers that this hospital involve, or the history of many layers of the history. The hospital was a major employer for our community. You know, you think of modern residents think about IBM as being a major employer here, but the hospital was probably equal to that at some point. I think if you talk to any resident here, they know somebody who has either worked at the hospital or was a resident at the hospital. And it's profound. You talk to everybody here, and they all have some memories. You know, some people played golf, but then some people went to church on the site, and some people, you know, at one point the hospital operated as a regular hospital, and you could go get surgery there. So it's important to me to encapsulate as much as I can of this history, and that's why I created this committee, and it involves or it entails staff of the hospital, the Nurses Alumni Association. I've got you know, Frankowski and Robert Kirkbride, and Ann Sherston, who's here. She's on our town council, and plus many other people, like James Roosevelt, FDR's father, owned part of the property. So I have the director of the FDR Presidential Library. And it's important to me to get all these brains together and come up with a creative and compassionate way to preserve the history of this site. So there are things that are already required amongst the developer, like interpretive panels, but I feel like we can ask for more. I think it's important to ask for more. And so to give that to Robert, at Parsons, he was able to use his class as, and use that idea of memorials as an inspiration.
Yeah, there are a couple of images scrolling through, not nearly as many as students produced, but of memorials both for the Greystone site and for the Hudson site, but also adaptive reuse of the overall Hudson site, including the ruins of the South Wing, which much of the community just says, okay, we forfeit those, just go ahead and build. The United States is unique in the fact that we cannot embrace ruins. Other countries, my God, you go to Rome, this city is a ruin. You go to other nations and history is incorporated. It's not this erase, replace cycle of redevelopment and a forward-moving arrow that tends to be very poorly equipped to acknowledge our difficult pasts. And as Jennifer, you were just saying, you want to erase, many want to erase. We talk with communities about that specifically because you erase, that's called repression. That is unhealthy. That is not the way to actually address and acknowledge and work through the many phantoms that we encounter on these sites and in our cultures with mental illness with us today. And I think, Paris, your point about the what some have called inflexible architecture of the buildings, that is up to us and our collective imagination to generate other alternatives. If we do not tap into that creative intelligence, we forfeit the opportunity to interact and participate and transform ourselves through transforming the historical materials that we have. And the positive news that we can share in all of this is that Buffalo is one of 7 sites in the last 5 years, 7 Kirkbrides, that have been adaptively reused to many different kinds of uses by universities. Athens is in the midst of working on theirs for elder care, for independent living. You have Alabama University at Tuscaloosa. It's a performing arts center with a museum to Alabama's history of mental illness, which is also fraught. Each site and each state is an opportunity and a challenge to get our heads around mental illness so we can better equip ourselves today to address the enormous issues that our youth and that all of us are facing today.
So with that, and maybe this might be our last question before we open it up for questions. Burying the past, when we were doing the Richardson campus, there were a number of people who said just bulldoze it, like there were horrible memories there. And you can understand, my view has been the Kirkbride-plan, the intentions of the city elders back then, they were all very good. There was a very humane approach, really, for the first time to how do we address this problem? And you know, looking at budgets and everything we were talking this morning, it's not like they were making a farm or a factory. They were building hospitals for patients to reintegrate them to society. So this adaptive reuse is fraught with challenges, not only the landscapes that have been overgrown or parking lots are on them. You have buildings that are so big and so onerous and toxic in some instances because asbestos was wonderful 100 years ago, not so much now. we have all of these challenges, and even at our campus, we're kind of like West Berlin. We're surrounded by an active mental health campus. So while we have restored these core buildings the state abandoned for 40 years, we have a 10-story active mental health building and rehab facilities on our grounds. So I can say that that healthful environment is being used. We see the patients out there. They use the space. One of the first things that the not-for-profit did when we did the restoration project was we rehabilitated the park and basically gave it to the community and said, you should come here. You should use this green space in a dense urban area where many people in our neighborhoods are renters. They don't have big backyards, and trying to play off of that, again, that healthful environment. So tying those things together, we're really asking ourselves the question in modern times, how does a civilized society take care of those with severe mental illness? And what we've done? Nothing. What we've done is we've avoided the issue, and we have said the prisons are the #1 healthcare provider in the U.S. It's fascinating. And so when you think about the green space and, again, the lungs of the city, or the calming effect, a place for refuge, and the asylums in that nexus, it's very powerful. And just a number, we were looking here in Worcester, it looks like they attempted, and I don't know the latest, but to house a prisoner is about $55,000 a year. To do a modern version of an asylum is about $200,000 a year per patient. So you can see the economics are extremely challenging, but we've abdicated and just, look this way, and it carries on through the prison system. So when we think about Olmsted and the goals that he espoused and making these green spaces, when you look today with mental health and probably a greater awareness and sympathy towards it, especially after COVID, how do you see maybe Olmsted's ideas? Are they more relevant today than they have been? Can these adaptive reuses really play off of the spirit of what they sought? And I'll let any of you answer that.
Short answer, yes. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because within landscape architecture scholarship, I mean, there is a host of people, not just historians, but people that do more quantitative. I do qualitative research, but there's a lot of studies that have been done that really help reinforce this idea that access to green space and views of green space are good for our mental well-being. It's good for students in schools, right? They perform better if there are, there's greenery outside the classroom window as opposed to a parking lot, for example. There's all kinds of studies that have been done that quantitatively demonstrate this, right? So I think there's partly that, as well as, like you said, with the COVID debacle that we all lived through, it really laid bare the fact that the inequities are quite profound in terms of who has access to and proximity to green space and who doesn't. So I think that it is absolutely relevant. And, the challenge, of course, with mental health is that in the mid 20th century, 60s and 70s especially, was the whole deinstitutionalization. And so, people were taken out of these types of spaces, and in many cases for good reasons, right? Because we won't get into controversies, but there was a lot of issues with these types of facilities. But then what's the answer, right? Because it's either people might be living on the street, or they're living on the street and then do something that is, unlawful, and then end up in a prison, and they're not being treated for their mental health issues, right? That some don't even get the medication that they need, right? And so then, what do? It's like, we do need to reimagine it somehow. But, that requires political and economic will as well, so, yeah.
Yeah, I would pick up from that, and there is a piece that I have spent a good amount of time working on for several years that's just about to come out with Places Journal, looking at these many different phantoms that converged on these buildings historically, why they were problematic, and these cruel twists of fate in 1854 when we were a presidential veto away from having a federal system of mental health care that Dorothea Dix and Kirkbride and the colleagues had really focused on. One presidential veto. And then the presidential work of JFK to deinstitutionalize his final bill that he signed, but it was never funded adequately because he was assassinated shortly thereafter, and it barely got through the votes with no funding attached. So there are cruel twists of fate that contributed to, on a social, political, and policy financial reason, why we don't have the sourcing that we needed at the time of the deinstitutionalization. And we have a spectrum of approaches that mean we don't need to put everyone as an inpatient in facilities any longer. So we're in a different place. There's opportunity to approach from a larger standpoint. But I think, Paris, your question about the infrastructures of incarceration, which also really point to American culture. We'd rather imprison people, and we have a terrible record on that, of using it as a real social tool of control. But if we consider that the way we look at social structures, the way we consider democracy now, the way we're performing, is radically not what Olmsted and Kirkbride projected as and defined as democracy. They defined democracy as deep participation, which assumes public support. Kirkbride's treatise is really clear. Of course you will be willing to pay this much more for to help mental illness a patient return to the world, because not doing that costs much more over time. There is a clear pragmatism that was held that Olmsted had as well. If you don't support your people, you will pay for it in the end. But our medicine system is not about preventative care, it's about reactive care. Our whole social network is about reactive behaviors, not proactive behaviors. So the democracy that we really need to support not only mental illness, but our public places and spaces, is precisely the kind of engagement that Yvonne and others of you in this room are committed to in our communities, to step into those voids and to challenge the bad mental habits of our development and erasure of our own histories.
So it's 20 past, and I haven't gotten the card yet. So Dee Dee, do we want to open up for questions or? For questions, right. So we've got some time for questions until 11:30. So if you hear the question better than I do, please restate it. Okay, right up front. Go for it. Oh. We have a runner.
Thank you.
So we have about 10 minutes.
So much of what many of you have said, at least three of you, in terms of, the deinstitutionalization of mental health care and everything that's happened, it just makes me wonder. At the time that all those institutes were being built, along the Erie Canal, what was it in American society? I have this gnawing thought that places that were built with these beautiful grounds allowed the families of people had relatives with mental problems who were probably going in and out of hospitals or in and out of prisons to feel like, oh, this is a good place. Look at how beautiful it is. Look at it. It's more like a park. This is a good place to put the person away. And I'm just wondering who or has there been research into that? Because you talk about how the numbers expanded. Why were there suddenly a need for 250 spots in a hospital and then building to 3,000 and 5,000? What was the aspect of American culture which said, oh, it's okay to put them away and institutionalize them? And did that green park setting allow people to feel like it's okay, we can put them away because it's a nice place? It's a terrible thought, but I'm wondering, have people looked into that and studied that? Thank you.
That's a question that I really wrestled with because on the one hand, you build it, they will come. You build a beautiful, pleasurable place, and the approach to it is, yes, that one can go there. And so on the one hand, there is a certain degree of convenience that does play into the darker side of human nature. It was terrifyingly easy to commit people to these facilities. So there are, as I've gone from community to community, Fergus Falls, Minnesota, talking with people whose elder siblings committed younger siblings out of fights over inheritance of the family farm. You had wives committing themselves to avoid spousal abuse. You had husbands committing wives over postpartum depression because we didn't know what it was, and then fostering off the children and remarrying within a year. You have very specific histories. Those aren't fictions, those are actual stories from communities and these difficult histories that formed. But we also had a little thing called the Civil War, and the mammoth scale of these buildings accelerated exponentially afterward, precisely because the bureaucracy, the war machine of the Union, then just re-engineered itself with its railroads and distribution of building materials to build mammoth structures for the thousands and thousands of people who needed care. And the estimate in 2012, if you look on Wikipedia, it will tell you 618,222 people, soldiers, died in battle, okay? 2012 reportage said, we're nowhere near the numbers. The actual numbers are closer to 850,000 soldiers, and the countless, as you know, the beautiful book written Night Watch, just recently, Pulitzer Prize winning book a couple of years ago, talks about the kind of confused stew that existed after the Civil War. You had families who were totally destroyed and disrupted, many other people who experienced trauma, not just soldiers in battle, amputees, etc. That led to a mammoth increase. And then we had Panic of 1873, and then we had world wars, and then we've been a nation facing crises and oftentimes creating them. And I think now one of the real crises we face is global warming and climate crises and the direct impacts that is having. That is going to impact all of our landscape planning and selection of plants and resilient plants, et cetera. The sites and places, we have to think very differently about the places that we inhabit today and will inhabit tomorrow.
Yeah, I just wanted to add quickly, there's a host of very complicated reasons why there was this exponential kind of committal of people. And our understanding of mental illness or health nowadays is very different than in the 19th century. One thing I didn't mention was this notion of moral treatment, which is this idea that, you do good work, you are in contact with nature, et cetera, that is born out of that Quaker tradition, right? But the way in which, I looked at a lot of annual reports from different institutions and really tried to understand committal related to, different diagnoses. So you could be committed because you believed in a different religion, for example, if you were a Mormon, if you were Seventh-day Adventist, right? If you felt too passionate about your religion, if somebody lost a business, if you were a woman, certainly expressing her sexuality in a way that was not Victorian, for example, you would definitely be committed. And things like if you were LGBTQ, right? I mean, so there's all these things. It was, and certain historians have really argued that it was a form of social control, right? And you could argue that now in some ways too, depending on your interpretations of that. But there's a whole host of things happening in the 19th century that kind of contribute to this notion. And that's kind of more the negative, but I think in terms of what Robert was talking about, there was also very much a sense of civic obligation to help people, you know, that seems, in my opinion, to be kind of absent in a lot of people in our country now. There was such a different sense of civic obligation to help people, right? And to do things that we have lost our way from. So that's all.
So we take the 30 seconds.
Sorry.
Up at the top, up at the top. Yeah. No, there's just behind you. There was top center is header.
I'm going to be really quick. First of all, Robert, we want to know your relationship to the doctor. Since you have the
Yes,
same
I'm
name.
related.
Yes. And then, rather than speak of a memorial for the Hudson Hospital site, I really want you to continue fighting for its restoration and conversion into a new site. And with that, I'd like Olmsted Network and everybody in this room to brainstorm on how we can help Yvonne, whether it's letter writing, whether it's postcards, whether it's, you know, a statement by Olmsted Network, whether it's our connections to the National Trust, I don't know, but let's try to do something and save these gorgeous buildings. Thank you.